Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. This episode of Victor's Children is my interview with Moshe Machover. But before we get to that, I'd like to start by thanking one listener, who on Instagram is at Lizar_Tistry, for the wonderful illustration that they made to communicate the ideas that were in the last episode of Victor's Children, episode 36, on what kind of anti-imperialism. You can see a link to this great illustration in the show notes for this episode. Also, one thing in the upcoming interview, at one point, Moshe Machover refers to the quote-unquote 20th Congress. That refers to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which happened in 1956. And at that event, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev criticized the late Joseph Stalin for his execution of many members of the Central Committee of the party and many members of the military high command in the 1930s, so-called excesses in agricultural collectivization and the deportations of many minority nationalities, along with other so-called mistakes. And the importance of this is that that speech sent reverberations through the parties around the world, which had looked to the USSR as socialist and treated Stalin in a worshipful way. So it really opened up challenges to orthodoxy. And of course, later that same year, 1956, the Hungarian Revolution happened, which was bloodily crushed by the USSR. And again, this contributed to the crisis of the so-called official communist movement. So with that little allusion explained, let's get on to episode 37 of Victor's Children. In 1962, a handful of former members of the Israeli Communist Party formed the Israeli Socialist Organization, later renamed the Socialist Organization in Israel, but best known by the name of its magazine, Matzpen, or Compass. For the 2 decades of its active existence, Matzpen, a group made up of both Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, had a political impact inside and outside Israel that was far beyond its very small size, thanks to its uncompromising anti-Stalinist revolutionary socialist opposition to Zionism from within Israel, and its pioneering analysis of Israel as a settler colonial society, which influenced the radical left internationally. In the show notes for this episode, you'll find links to Matzpen material online, related readings, and a video documentary about the group. Matzpen's Marxist analysis and perspective for the struggle against Zionist settler colonialism are still very relevant today. So I'm honored to be speaking with Moshe Machover. Moshe lives in the UK and is the only one of the 4 founding members of Matzpen who's alive today. So thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
I would like to start by asking you about Jabra Nicola, who played an important role in the group's development, but I think is too little known today. So could you tell listeners who Jabra was?
Jabra Nicola was a Palestinian Arab. He would stress Arab Marxist, and in my view, the most original theoretician of the prospects and the direction of the Arab Revolution. He was born in 1912 in Haifa. His father was, he was employed in the colonial administration of Britain in Cyprus. But he died when Jabra was very young. I think he was 11. And to cut a long story short, the family became déclassé. Jabra's mother was cheated of his father's inheritance by some crook, and they ended in poverty. So Jabra didn't complete formal education after a very early age. He didn't complete his elementary education formally. He was entirely self-taught. he joined the Communist Party of Palestine, the Palestine Communist Party, as a young man, and his brilliance was recognized by the party. In 1935, I believe he was elected to the Central Committee of the party. Very young man. At some stage, he was attracted to Trotskyism. By the way, I only knew Jabra in the last 11 years of his life. He died in 1974, I believe. So I met him in 1963, early 1963, soon after Matzpen was founded. By what I've learned from various sources, he was attracted to Trotskyism around the year 1940. Now, he told me actually that what attracted his attention was an article that was published in some Egyptian journal about Trotsky's tendency in world communist movement. I read elsewhere that Yigal Greenstein, also known as Tony Cliff, later known as Tony Cliff, persuaded him to join a Trotskyist group that existed in Palestine around, I think Tony Cliff's report is that it happened in 1940, that in 1940 he joined after discussions with Tony Cliff. Tony Cliff claimed that he converted Jabra to Trotskyism. That may or may not be true. Tony Cliff was a prominent member of this very small group, made up mostly of refugees from Germany, Trotskyist refugees from Germany who ended up in Palestine, not by choice, but simply because they had to go somewhere, fled from the Nazi regime. In 1942-43, the Communist Party split along national lines, and Jabra didn't join either the split. Either he helped, he supported to some extent the activities of each of the two groups, but didn't join either of them. I think this is typical of him. He was the most anti-nationalist person I've ever met in the Marxist movement, thorough internationalist. And I don't think he liked the fact that the party split along national lines. He was incarcerated by the British mandate along the other activists of the party after the outbreak of the war, but was released when the Soviet Union joined the war after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Okay, I mean, I as I said, I came to know him in early 1963, shortly after Matzpen was founded. We published a paper, and this attracted his attention. During 1963, at some stage, he joined, first of all, informally, and then formally, along with with a few other comrades in Haifa. It was at that stage that Matzpen became, international, that is to say, included comrades from both nationalities in Israel. We were looking to recruit Palestinian Arab comrades, but failed to make proper contact. You see, it was difficult while we were organizing. We were still in the Communist Party, and it was very difficult to make contact across branches. There's the sort of discipline in the Stalinist movement. The founders of Matzpen happened to be in branches in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem where there were no Palestinian Arab members. We were trying to make contact with Haifa comrades, but as it happened, they found us. Instead of us finding them, they found us. And so what I can say is that Jabra had a tremendous influence on the development of the ideas of Matzpen. We were not fully formed. It was fortunate that all this happened in the 1960s. The period between the Suez War of 1956 and the June War of 1967 was the one where the issue of Israel and the Palestinians, Israel and the Arab world was most quiescent. There was very little happening. And so it gave us leisure to develop ideas. And it was in this period that Jabra joined Matzpen very soon after it was formed. And he had an enormous influence on the ideas of Matzpen regarding the Palestinian situation and the Arab world in general.
Could you outline the political approach then that was developed under his influence?
Well, first of all, his perspective was of Arab revolution rather than looking at the Palestinian or Israeli-Palestinian issue in the Palestine box. That was the first precept. And for reasons, I mean, the logic behind this, I can explain later, but I mean, the bottom line was that the Palestinian problem cannot be solved under capitalism, that it requires a social transformation, not just of the Israel-Palestine box, but of the entire Arab region, at the very least the Arab East, which means, from the middle of Libya eastwards. What led him to this conclusion is we can discuss later, but this was a precept. He also educated us regarding the effect of Zionist colonization on the evolution or the distorted evolution of Palestinian society from the start of Zionist colonization till the point we were talking about after the creation of Israel. In his view, and I think it was correct, Zionist colonization had a distorting effect on stunting the evolution of Palestinian Arab society, which was in the start of Zionist colonization, when it started in the beginning of the 20th century, it was on the threshold of modernity. He also helped us to form, together with him, an analysis of the specific nature of Zionist colonization. As you probably know, Marxist analysis recognizes basically three types of colonization in modern times. I'm talking about modern times. There is plantation colonization, of which what became the southern part of the United States is an example, the West Indies, Brazil. There is political economies based on the exploitation of indigenous labor force, which is what happened in a lot of Africa, in much of Africa, especially after the Vienna Congress. A prime example is perhaps South Africa, where the political economy was based on the indigenous exploitation of the indigenous labor force. The main producers were indigenous people. And finally, there is the model of colonization which is familiar in the north of North America, Canada and the non-slave states of the United States, what became the non-slave states of the United States, and in which the main labor force, the main direct producers are themselves settlers. This is roughly what is known in academic discourse, post-colonial discourse, as settler colonialism. But academic discourse fails to make a crucial distinction between the settler colonialism of South Africa and the settler colonialism of North America, Australia, for example, and Palestine. In both cases, there is a lot of presence of settlers. There is a fairly large community of settlers, but the political economy is quite different. And for Marxists, this is a crucial difference. So to cut a long story short, we came very soon, and this was for us not a difficult idea to digest. I mean, we're quite prepared and mentally and ideologically to accept this analysis. The Zionist colonization belongs to that type of colonization whose political economy is based mainly on the settlers as direct producers. And then, of course, what happens is that in this type of colonization, the indigenous population is surplus to requirement. And that is really the key to understand the history of Zionist colonization. I think it's also the key to understanding a lot of the history of North America, by the way, under very different circumstances, because Zionist colonization, although belonging to the same type, is a very atypical member of this group for various reasons. I've written about this, and you can see in articles that I have written over the years still a great influence of the ideas of Jabra Nicola.
So perhaps we could then move to the political implications, because as you've said, this analysis has certain important political implications. And you've argued, for example, that unlike in what happened in South Africa, if we look at Palestine, you've argued there does not exist a social force that could lead a so-called bourgeois democratic decolonization. In other words, there's no social force that could dismantle Zionist settler colonialism and create a capitalist democracy with equal rights for all citizens. So could you explain that for listeners?
Let me put it this way. In order to decolonize Israel-Palestine, what it means in this context, it has to be de-Zionized. The Zionist regime has to be overthrown. The point is that unlike the case of South Africa, where the indigenous labor force had a huge leverage on the economy of South Africa, it was not surplus to requirement, it was the basis of the whole economy. They had leverage which enabled them to overthrow the apartheid regime in South Africa and make some gains, even short of achieving socialism. During the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, it was often mentioned by the anti-apartheid movement, both in and outside South Africa, that this liberation is going to lead to socialism. This did not happen. Nevertheless, the South African working class, mostly indigenous people, made some undeniable gains, even without achieving socialism. In other words, there were gains that this class could make even short of achieving political power, which it hasn't, but nevertheless be liberated from apartheid. And it was crucial in overthrowing the apartheid regime in South Africa. I think people outside South Africa have, in my opinion, a rather exaggerated view of the influence of outside forces on the overthrow of the apartheid. Without the activity of the South African working class, it wouldn't have happened. I think the two main factors in the overthrow of apartheid was the inner struggle of the working class and the defeat of South Africa in what was southwestern Africa, in Namibia, etc. It was a military defeat. None of this is likely in the case of Israel. There is no analogous force. The idea that the Zionist regime can be overthrown from outside by outside forces is illusory. I think if you just look at the balance of forces, it's been tried, but all attempts at overthrowing the Israeli state from the outside ended in predictable, dismal failure. I think it leads to the conclusion, and I think Jabra saw it before most people realized it, that the overthrow of the Zionist regime must be an inside job. That is to say, it must be done by whom? Not by the Palestinian subjects who were when we met. I mean, the majority of the Palestinian people were refugees inside Jordan and in other Arab countries. There was a relatively small minority of Palestinians in Israel itself. It would have to be the Israeli Jewish working class who would have to be at least a partner in the overthrow of the Zionist regime. But then, what would be the gain of the Israeli Jewish working class in overthrowing the Zionist regime? If it would end up, as many good people project, in a secular democratic bourgeois state, then it would mean for the Jewish working class exchanging its position of an exploited class, but as part of a privileged nation, the exploiting nation, exchanging this status to a status of a still exploited working class as part of a non-privileged national entity. What is the gain in this? Why should the Israeli working class want to exchange its position of a part of a privileged dominant national group to a position of a part of a non-privileged national group without gaining anything else? This would be not attractive for the Israeli Jewish working class. On the other hand, given a socialist transformation, which would have to be regional, I mean, thinking of a socialist transformation in the Israeli-Palestinian box is absurd, would have to be a regional transformation of a socialist nature. Then the Israeli working class would be offered the deal of exchanging its position of an exploited class, which is part of a dominant nation, to a position of a part of the ruling class, but without national privileges. This is a deal that makes historical sense. And I think this projection led Jabra, and he persuaded us to the idea that the resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict would have to assume a socialist transformation, which would have to be regional, as part of a socialist Arab revolution.
You've brought up the really important question of the national or settler colonial privileges of the Jewish Israeli working class. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that for listeners, because I'm living in the Canadian state where there's certainly also settler colonial privilege that's conferred on non-Indigenous people. But I think the scale of the magnitude of those privileges are much greater in the case of the Israeli working class, I think uniquely greater in the world today. So I'm wondering if you could say something about the analysis of that, of the Israeli Jewish working class that was developed in Matzpen, and maybe any thoughts you might have today about the magnitude of those national privileges.
Well, I think, first of all, if we look at the Palestinian working class outside the Green Line, that is to say in the occupied territories, then the difference in rights is huge. It has been defined by various human rights organizations, including the main Israeli ones, B'Tselem, as apartheid. Of course, we have to be careful in using this term apartheid, because it doesn't mean apartheid in the same sense as in South Africa. As I explained, the situation there was very different in the political economy was entirely different. But apartheid, as defined by international law, there is an international definition of the crime of apartheid, and this applies. I find it hard to think where to begin. I mean, the Israeli Jewish working class live in what is an approximation to a liberal democracy. Well, it's not quite a liberal democracy. A lot of it is a facade, but there are still a lot of elements of protection of individual rights, freedom to organize in trade unions, etc., etc. The Palestinian Arab workers in the occupied territories are devoid of any rights. I mean, there is some employment of this labor force in Israel. It's not a crucial part of the Israeli economy. Nevertheless, they are employed in conditions that are not only hugely different in terms of the remuneration, but in terms of actually the ability to reach your workplace. I mean, the Palestinian worker mostly, I mean, those who are lucky enough to have a permit to be employed in Israel itself or in the settlements, nevertheless have enormous obstacles in getting to work. The majority of the Palestinian working class the occupied territories are suffering from a huge level of unemployment. The level of pay is abysmal, etc., etc. They are living under a direct colonial rule. The position of Arab workers inside Israel, those who are citizens of Israel, is a little bit better, but far inferior to those of the Israeli Jewish workers. Until 1966, the Palestinian Arab community within Israel was still under martial law. There was military rule that controlled their movements. They needed permits to go from one place to another. Their lives were directly controlled by the Israeli military. To a great extent, although the formal military rule has been lifted, to a great extent, there is an extreme level of discrimination in pay condition and in civil rights between Israeli Jewish workers and Palestinian Arab workers inside Israel. Those I'm stressing those who are still. So this is the situation. I mean, if you want to get detailed picture of this discrimination, then a good place to look is the website of Adalah. Adalah has a website in Arabic, Hebrew, and English, where Adalah means justice in Arabic, and it is an organization of human rights, especially workers' rights of Palestinians inside Israel mainly. You can find out a lot of the aspects of discrimination in terms of laws and practices which are not enacted by law but are customary discrimination.
So I think we can look at the legacy of Matzpen and see that unfortunately the approach that it advanced was not widely adopted, to say the least, by Palestinian socialists or by socialists in other parts of the region in the 1970s or since then, although there have been and still are some socialists who support it or something quite similar to it. Do you have any thoughts about how we explain this, the lack of influence of this important perspective, and what the main obstacles have been to this kind of a politics being more widely adopted in the region?
I think that the explanation for this is not to be sought in purely local circumstances. I think what we are talking about really is the decline, the defeat of the revolutionary Marxist movement since the 1970s. We managed to make some gains at the time, but about the time that Jabra died here in London was the beginning of a big recession. I think you could raise the same question, not just regarding Israel, Palestine, the Middle East, the Arab world, but worldwide. The reasons for this, I think it would take us far away from the specific subject. But I'm not sure that I'm the best person to analyze the reasons for this decline. But the phenomenon itself is, I think, unmistakable. We are living in a period of defeat of the working class. There is also some specific reason. I think Jabra Matzpen split several ways, but the most important and damaging split was between the members of Matzpen who were affiliated, like Jabra, to the Mandelite Fourth International, and those of us who did not want to affiliate Matzpen. The paradox was that although Jabra himself was affiliated to this Fourth International, and the group that followed this route actually got very far from his ideas about Arab nationalism. They over the years, until they ceased to exist, went in a direction that was the polar opposite of what Jabra advocated. In other words, they got close to supporting Palestinian nationalism, which was anathema for Jabra. I mean, Jabra warned when the Fatah of the leading nationalist movement in the Palestinian community was at its highest level of influence. He warned that Arafat, the leader of this movement, will betray the Palestinian cause. He warned us against this. He was enormously suspicious of the PLO, very critical. Those who were supposed to follow his Trotskyist worldview, who seceded from Matzpen in 1972, actually took the opposite view. They got sort of close to supporting with very little criticism the position of Fatah and the PLO generally. So the people who were supposed to actually carry forward his ideas and who had contact with their corresponding groups in the Arab world, for what it's worth, I mean, they weren't huge, but there was some people in Lebanon, for example. They instead of advocating his ideas, they very soon drifted in an opposite direction. Paradoxically, the people who remained sort of advocating and developing the ideas that Jabra was responsible for were the non-Trotskyists in Matzpen. This is the way things happened, but we lacked the organizational contact with fraternal groups in the Arab world. We had a lot of individual contact with prominent Arab socialists in various Arab countries. This was open and advertised and published, but the failure was to create regional organization that would carry forward these ideas. And without an actual organization, ideas are very difficult to translate into practice.
Perhaps I would just add, for the sake of listeners who may not know the history, of course, that we really need to remember that in the 1970s, Stalinism still had a tremendous influence on the left, including the Palestinian left, with its ideas of a two-stage theory of the struggle, that where national liberation would have to precede any specifically anti-capitalist stage, and a whole conception of socialism, the idea that there were really actually existing socialist countries that would be an ally of the struggle, and so on. Could you say something briefly about that political context, which is perhaps unfamiliar for some listeners?
Well, I mean, this for us was a formative concept because the very creation of Matzpen was a move, first of all, against the Stalinism of the official communist movement. I mean, you said that we were members of the Communist Party. The people originally formed the kernel of Matzpen. Some of us were members, some of us were supporters of the Communist Party. But following the 20th Congress and various other developments, the events in Hungary in 1956 and various other similar developments, we began to be critical of the Soviet Union, no longer taking idea that the Soviet Union is the great light of nations. We at first did not subscribe to the idea that the Soviet Union was not socialist. We regarded it as some kind of deformed socialism, but what we were rebelling against is the fact that the communist parties outside the Soviet bloc were actually used as public relations agencies for the Soviet Union. They were not engaged in fighting for socialist revolution, but were engaged in furthering the international foreign interests of the Soviet Union. Example of that was the events, for example, in Iraq in 1958, where I would not have time to go into the details of what happened. The anti-royalist revolution that took place in 1958, where the Communist Party turned out to be the most powerful, the well-organized party that was able to preserve itself in the opposition. But instead of trying to achieve power for the Iraqi working class, it followed the instructions of the Soviet leadership and fought for a role of second violin in the Iraqi political constellation. And of course, they ended up by being decimated, slaughtered, and so on. This happened in several other countries. Once we were outside of the Communist Party, it was easy for us to develop a more thorough critique of Stalinism. Jabra also helped in this respect, without accepting, let us say, the full package of Trotskyist critique and the traditional program and so on. We didn't necessarily accept this, but the kernel idea that what we had there is not a Marxist idea of socialism, that was easy to digest, and we soon sort of took this position, so more thorough critical of the Soviet Union.
Thank you. So perhaps as we move to wrap up, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about to what extent the kind of analysis, the approach that Matzpen developed needs to be modified today in light of changes in the region or changes in the world, or more broadly, any closing thoughts you might have about the implications of this political legacy for socialists today?
My idea about this is that maybe you regard this as perverse, but I think that very little has to be modified in essence. I think the basic idea is valid. There has been the main change that occurred over those decades is that whereas when Matzpen was formed and still in the 1970s, the idea of Arab unification was, at least a secular idea of Arab unification was quite widespread and popular. It receded, and secular Arab nationalism has been has receded, and in its place we have the rise of Islamic ideology. I mean, in the 1950s, 1960s, Islamism was in retreat. Bourgeois Arab nationalism was secular. So, I mean, this left at least a margin for socialists to advance the kind of Marxist analysis and Marxist program that is essentially secular and goes beyond the confines of bourgeois nationalism. This has receded, but from time to time you see a resurgence of this idea, and I think that a very interesting moment in recent times is the Arab Spring of 2011. Suddenly, out of almost apparently nowhere, the feeling of Arab unity, that is to say, the fact that the Arab world is one entity divided by imperialists, but that is really, in some sense, one domain whose development, events in one part of it are echoed and have direct influence in other parts of the same region. This suddenly came up, was felt in practice. Obviously, it didn't last very long, but it's a kind of preview of what can happen. And in a way, it was a confirmation that under the surface, the ideas that we advocated long ago are not without let us say, its viability in the present situation. I'm sure that once revolutionary developments will take place in one part of the Arab world, it will have an immediate echo and repercussion in other parts of the same region, because it is really one region that has been balkanized by imperialist domination.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.